Without further ado, Dr. Dennis Britton, Associate Professor of English at University of New Hampshire. His research interests include early modern English literature, especially the literature of William Shakespeare and Edmund Spenser, Protestant theology, critical race theory, and the history of emotion. He's the author of Becoming Christian, Race, Reformation, and Early Modern English Romance, written in 2014, and co-editor with Melissa Walter of Rethinking Shakespeare's Source Study, Audiences, Authors, and Digital Technologies. He's also the co-editor with Kimberly Coles of a special issue of the journal Spencer Studies on Spencer and Race, and he's currently working on not one, but two books, Shakespeare and Pity, Feeling Human Difference on the Early Modern Stage, and Reforming Ethiopia, African Anglo Relations in Protestant England. Education, it is BA at USC, and his MA and PhD in English at the University of Wisconsin. I'll close with this. We're also blessed to have Dr. Dennis Britton as one of our board members alongside Evan Chizowski as an example. So with that being said, and with no further ado, Dr. Dennis Britton, sir, you have the stage.
All right, thank you very much, Anthony and Tricia, for the introduction, as well as for this opportunity to participate in the Black Thought series. And a shout out to my family in California. I see you, and it's nice to see you. I haven't seen them in a while, as you can imagine. So I was asked to give this talk quite a while ago. And when I was asked to give the talk, I don't think any of us knew that the topic would be in the headlines and that it would be so relevant to so many of the conversations. I mean, the topic is always relevant in my opinion, but it seems to be particularly relevant with where we are as a country today. So with that, I will get started. The talk has changed slightly based on our recent headlines. I think in the description it did say that I'm going to talk about when did Jesus become white, and I will get to that eventually. So don't, if that's why you're here, I'll eventually get to that. But I want to start with some other things first. So for those of you who have been watching the news, you might have seen headlines such as this. This is from Newsweek Wednesday. Activist who wants white Jesus statues torn down says Christian whiteness has always been violent. So this headline is a response to a series of tweets by the activist Shaun King. And I'll just go ahead and read the tweets so that we're all on the same page. So this is Shaun King's tweet. Yes, I think the statues of the white European they claim is Jesus should also come down. They are a form of white supremacy, always have been. In the Bible, when the family of Jesus wanted to hide and blend in, guess where they went? Egypt, not Denmark. Tear them down. Yes, and the murals and stained glass windows of white Jesus, his European mother and their white friends also should come down. They are a gross form of white supremacy, created as tools of oppression, racist propaganda. They should all come down. So one of the things I've been interested in has been the responses to King's tweets. So I am not here to apologize or to defend King, but I do find the responses very telling and worth thinking about for a second. Even our own president has had things to say about these tweets. So this has definitely hit a national nerve, or for some it has hit a nerve. So some, not surprisingly, have agreed with King's tweet in the sentiments of the tweet. And indeed, I would just also like to point out that, there's actually nothing all that unique about what he is saying here. There is a tradition, and many Black theologians and anti-racist theologians have made similar points about the whiteness of Jesus, their connections to white supremacy, and seeing them as tools of propaganda. So King's response is not all that unique. But of course, not everyone has agreed. And I've also been interested in those who haven't agreed and their grounds for condemning King. Some have condemned King's tweets based on the artistic merit of many of these works, right? So these are great works of art. Why would we just destroy these beautiful works of art? Some Roman Catholics have criticized this tweet because they feel like, well, I am just as able to venerate an Anglo Jesus as I am able to venerate a Black Madonna, right? So for them, you know, it's not about the color, you know, of the icon or the statue or the image, but it's about the, you know, who the image is of, right? But then others have seen King's tweet as anti-Christian itself, right? And have said that this is an attack on Christianity, and we need to fight against this particular anti-Christian sentiment. So my question is, why would some read King's tweet as an attack on Christianity, right? The answer for many of you probably is obvious, but for me, when I read King's tweets, I say, well, King is definitely not condemning these images of Jesus, right? So of course we all know that there are many multicultural, multiracial, or, you know, representations of Jesus from other cultures. So we have a 19th century representation, Chinese representation of Jesus. In the middle, we have a Maori Jesus from 2014 by the artist Sophia Minson, who is of Maori descent herself. And then we have a 6th century representation of Jesus from Ethiopia, right? So we have an Asian Jesus, we have an indigenous Jesus, and we have a Black Jesus, right? And of course, there's is a tradition of people recreating Jesus in their own image. Many of you will also be familiar with this image. So this is a 2001 image, and it was created for a BBC documentary. But the image was constructed by a forensic anthropologist using a 1st century skull, Jewish skull. And the claim was not that this is what Jesus actually looked like, but this is what someone of Jesus's age from that part of the world, you know, he would much more likely to look like this than the image on the left here, which is arguably one of the most famous images of Jesus produced in the 20th century. So this is an image called The Head of Christ. It was produced in 1940 by the American artist Warner Solomon. The image on the right, of course, you can see is, and I don't know who did the one on the right, but you can see that someone has re-rendered Solomon's image as African as Jesus. But to Solomon's Jesus, this is particularly interesting because it is one of the most reproduced artworks of the 20th century, right? And it is arguably, I think some have said it is the most reproduced image of Jesus of the 20th century. There have been somewhere, according to one estimation, over 500 million reproductions of this image, and you'll see them worldwide, right? So in spite of, you know, various representations of Jesus from various places, in spite of attempts to produce a more historically accurate Jesus, if you Google Jesus in Google Images, this is what you get, right? So we do get the image from 2001 by the forensic anthropologist, but we mostly get images of a fair-complected, white-skinned, fair-eyed, flowing-locked Jesus who looks nothing like Jesus from 1st century Palestine would have looked, right? And I will do my best not to comment on this image here, which is this strange reconstructed trinity of John Wayne, Donald Trump, and Jesus. And for whatever reason, Jesus is wearing an American flag sash. But again, I will not comment on that. I will leave that for you to meditate upon. So in spite of a variety of representations of Jesus, in spite of an attempt to produce a more historically accurate representation of the historical Jesus, and I guess, you know, according to this meme, just good old common sense, this image of the white Jesus remains. And we can see from opposition to King that there are quite a few very strong investments in a white Jesus, and people get quite heated when you question white Jesus, and they have somehow suggested that he is equivalent to Christianity itself. So one of the things that I think we should think about is, again, remembering that King's tweet is not unique, but also we should think about the fact that there actually isn't anything all that anti-Christian about this idea of tearing down images, right? So one of the things I would suggest is that we read King's tweet within a history of particularly Christian iconoclasm. So iconoclasm comes from a Greek word meaning image breaking, and it is the belief and practice of destroying images and monuments for the sake of a political or religious cause. And there are at least, within Western Christianity, there are at least two well-known moments of Christian iconoclasm. One is in 8th century Byzantium, and I won't say anything about that because I know very little about it, but I try to only talk about things I know at least a little bit about. But the one that I am much more familiar with comes from the Protestant Reformation, right? So one of my scholarly interests is the Protestant Reformation. And in the Reformation across Europe in the 16th century, Protestants who followed Luther in particular, not Luther, who followed Calvin, John Calvin, the French theologian, the French Protestant theologian. So Protestants who followed Calvin rather than Luther really went to war against images. Their argument was that images were, or having images in churches was in direct opposition to the biblical commandment, thou shalt not have graven images, right? So throughout Europe, images were torn down in churches, and we can see an example of that in this illustration. So this is a 16th century Dutch illustration in which we can see the activities of iconoclasm, and interestingly enough, they are pretty similar to what King has called for. We see this guy with a big stick about to smash some stained glass windows. We see some people with ropes tied to statues about to tear them down. We see hammers. Interestingly enough, we also see a guy who seems to be sneaking out of the church with a big bag full of goodies, right? So I think it's a sort of interesting thing to think about, this connection between iconoclasm and looting. And that even, I think, in what's the sort of, connection between these two things, even in this illustration of iconoclasm from the Reformation, and thinking about looting also as a political act. I think that's one of the things that this image also allows us to think about. This is an image from Ely Cathedral in England. I used to direct a study abroad program in Cambridge, and this was one of the field trips we would take to this cathedral. And it's a place where students could see the effects of Reformation iconoclasm quite, up close and personal. We can see, that, once upon a time prior to the Reformation, these stained glass, these would have been stained glass windows, brightly colored. There would have been statues in the niches, but all of these have been torn down. This is not the best image, but one of that maybe you can see that all of these are statues or little figures of human figures, but all of the heads of the figures were chopped off or smashed out, right? So for Protestants following John Calvin, there was this real anxiety about images, right? And the messages that images conveyed to Protestants, but also a fear that these images could lead to idolatry, right? Now, of course, so there is a particular, so all this to say again, there is this particular Christian tradition of iconoclasm that is particularly, at least more directly might be related to us following the Protestant Reformation. All right, so with that context, again, I'll go back to this question, why would some read King's tweet as an attack on Christianity? Well, I have an answer to that question. And for me, that question, again, I don't think this is particularly profound. I think this is what many people who are invested in a anti-racist theology, their Christianity cannot be separated from a vision of a white savior, right? So for them, to attack white Jesus is to attack Christianity itself. So these are some of the claims that I am interested in pursuing today, and some of the things I've been thinking about in relationship to this topic. So one, which is more related to my particular area of research and focus, is that representations of Jesus since at least, I try to stick to things that I know something about, since at least the Middle Ages, and the insistence that Jesus is white need to be understood within a long history of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And the other claim I would make is we need to read representations of Jesus alongside the stories being told about white and Black people. So when we say white supremacy, that makes some folks nervous. So I thought I would just provide a very basic definition of white supremacy, as well as anti-Blackness. So of course, white supremacy refers to beliefs and ideas about the natural superiority of white people, right? So, this is the stuff, that, neo-Nazis and the KKK and all those groups sort of, very explicitly put forward. But there are also more covert, subliminal, less obvious forms of white supremacy that show themselves in, again, more explicit and more implicit ways. The belief that ideas, the culture, and ways of knowing of white people are more valid and are of greater value than those belonging to non-white people. Right. So a definition of anti-Blackness is the antagonism of resistance to Black people, their culture, values, and objectives, right? So one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about, or will show today, is that we do see white supremacy and we do see anti-Blackness in the medieval period, as well as in the Renaissance, right? That these ideas are not just modern concepts, but they have a long history. And that these representations of Jesus and Christianity and the saints and who is a Christian and who is not a Christian are connected to this history of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Okay, but just a little bit of how did Jesus become white? So since I did say I would talk about that, I'll say a little bit. So one of the sort of consensus that I've sort of seen in reading up on the topic is that it begins with the Emperor Constantine. So Constantine the Roman Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity in 312. So prior to that, Christianity is an underground religion. People are practicing it in secret. Well, once Constantine becomes a Christian, people are able to practice it more openly. But what happens, again, this is my reading up on the topic from other people talking about this, is that once Christianity becomes legal and it begins to spread throughout the Roman Empire, with that spread come Romanized depictions of Christ and the apostles and the saints, right? So on the one hand, these are people who never saw Christ personally or the apostles, right? So they are representing biblical figures within their own artistic aesthetic, right? But this artistic aesthetic does begin to spread throughout the empire. But for my purposes, again, I'm more interested in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. For me, we really see this whitening of Jesus and the saints beginning in the Middle Ages and in quite explicit, direct ways. So what I have here is a quote from the French abbot Bernard de Clairvaux. And I have Pseudo here because a lot of scholars say, well, actually, this very popular work of the Middle Ages called the Meditations. Clairvaux actually didn't write this, but it was attributed to him afterwards, right? So the Meditations of Bernard de Clairvaux emerge in the 13th century, and they are attributed to this monk who died in 1153. But this is what Clairvaux, or the Pseudo Clairvaux, says in the Meditations. Oh, how was the beauty of thy excellent composed body obscured with spots of blood? How was the pure white color of thy skin made black and blue with bitter blows, my most beautiful Jesus, right? So, one of the things that I think about here, or like ask myself is, well, why does Clairvaux have to have, I'm sorry, for Clairvaux, why does Jesus have to have white skin? So one of the things to sort of think about here, sort of know about the importance of Clairvaux, is that Clairvaux's Meditations was one of the most popular devotional works of the Middle Ages. It circulated widely throughout Europe, and it was very important to a tradition of a medieval devotional practice known as effective piety. And effective piety was basically the idea that meditating upon the passion or the suffering of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. This could happen through written text as well as through visual media. That the deep meditation upon the suffering of Christ and the Virgin Mary would lead the Christian closer to God, right? So this is a work that medieval Christians could use or would use to sort of elevate their spirituality or become closer to God, right? So for what this passage tells me is that Jesus's white skin becomes an important vehicle for Christian devotion, right? That it's not enough that Jesus just becomes black and blue, but it's specifically that his white, beautiful body becomes colored, right? It becomes less white. And it is that process of not becoming white that leads to the sorrow, to the tears, to the sobs, all of which lead the medieval Christian closer to God. All right. So there's a tradition of effective piety really inspires how the scenes of the crucifixion are rendered both in writing, but in art as well, right? So I'm not picking on El Greco. I just think it's it's an image I like. I think it's a particularly moving, powerful image. But El Greco this is called The Crucifixion, 1600 in Spain. We can see just how white Jesus is. Now, on the one hand, El Greco is known for this high contrast, right? So not only in his religious paintings, but if you look at any of his portraits of, secular people as well, you're going to see this stark contrast between white and dark colors, right? So this is part of his general aesthetic, but it does work particularly well within traditional Christian iconography, in which Christ and Christianity are associated with light and whiteness and purity, while sin and sadness and death are associated with darkness, right? So the traditional Christian symbolism really easily maps onto this representation of the crucifixion. But one of my questions I think about is, what does it mean to sort of take traditional symbols that might associate black with bad, with evil, with sin, and white with good, and then to layer that traditional symbolism onto human bodies, right? And that's one of the things we see in these representations of Christ. We also see this whitening and darkening in tales of the saints. So today I would like to sort of draw our attention to two particular saints that I sort of seen this happening in. One is Saint Katherine of Alexandria. So just a quick overview of the story. Saint Katherine, this beautiful virgin from Alexandria, Christian, refuses to forsake her Christianity and and bow to Roman gods. And because of this, she is tortured and eventually killed, right? So even after being tortured, she refuses to forsake her Christianity, which leads to her death. So in an English 14th century life of St. Catherine, we see the author using images of whiteness and blackness and redness and color to emphasize the story, but as well, again, I would suggest to help the medieval reader or listener to the story feel what's happening more passionately. So the first quote, they are the Romans, they made her body all red blood run. So this is the Middle English, I'll just translate into contemporary English. They made her body all red with blood run, that first was white as whale's bones, right? So St. Catherine, she's from Alexandria, but for whatever reason, she has skin that is white as whale's bones, right? And we have, this image of, red blood on white skin, which really taps into the imagery that we saw in Clarivaux of red blood on Christ's white skin. So they whip her, they torture her, and the expectation is that Catherine is going to forsake Christ, reject her Christianity, and just give in. But instead, this is what Catherine says, "Then spake the maiden where she stood, among the Saracens so black." Right, so at this point, the enemies of Christianity, the torturers, are explicitly labeled as Saracens, which as a word for which really alludes to Islamic peoples, Muslims, but they're also black, right? So we get the contrast between the white virgin saint and the enemies of Christianity, who are, although they are Roman, right, somehow all of a sudden, for the sake of the story, become Muslim and black. At the end of the story, right, so after they've done all that they can to make Catherine forsake her Christianity, and when they realize nothing will work, they decide to cut off her head. And this is what happens following her head being cut off. But instead of blood, milk ran out. Above her stood the man killer. He was full black. Right, so again, we get this emphasis on the enemy of Christ, the enemy of Christians being black, right? So the executioner is this black man who's standing over her. And this tale is so invested in Catherine's whiteness that she can't even have red blood, right? Now, this is part of the legend of St. Catherine. It's not just in this version, it crops up in a variety of versions of this tale in which St. Catherine bleeds white milk instead of blood. All right, so this is part of, this is not unique to this, but again, I think, this tale is uses color imagery really intentionally. And in that intention, we're seeing the ways in which whiteness, white skin is associated with the divine, with the pure, with the spiritual. And in opposition to that, we have this really explicit anti-Blackness, right? Which is associated with anti-Christianity. So Saint Catherine wasn't the only one. We also see this phenomenon in tales of Saint Margaret of Antioch. Her story is very similar. Christian, beautiful, young. The governor of Antioch wants to marry her, but to marry her, she must convert to Christianity. She refuses, and the rest is history. But here are some descriptions from a account of a 13th century account of the life of Saint Margaret. The accused villains laid on so violently that her fair skin was broken all over and streamed with blood. The executioners laid on so cruelly that the blood burst out and down her body like a stream from a spring. A little bit later, the wretched menials did so at once, began to torture her, so that the snow white skin blackened as it was scorched and broke into blisters as it swelled all over, and her beautiful body crackled in the flame, so that there was an outcry from all those who saw the pitiful injury to her soft side, right? So again, we're seeing the ways in which the author is using emotion, right, to make us feel upset or bad about the torturing of St. Catherine, but particularly the torturing of this beautiful young white woman, right? And again, we see the way color is being involved, to become less white, to become black, to be blackened by the flames is seen as the thing that causes the outcry from those who are watching it, right? So they're like, oh no, this is too much, this is too bad. So one of the things that I see in these tales is, you know, which I think we sort of is a way we ought to read these, as these tales are actually tales of racial violence, but they're actually racial, you know, they're being cast as racial violence against white people, right? That you have these Black enemies, these anti-Christian enemies who seem to be specifically sort of out to get beautiful young white women, right? And of course, you know, we could talk about that's a whole narrative, right? That has that has some similarities to narratives in the 19th and 20th century America, right? But you know, but these stories again and again point to the white skin of these saints and often make the enemies of these saints Black. All right. So that's one location where we see whiteness being elevated, and we see a form of white supremacy as well as anti-Blackness. But one of the most prominent discourses of anti-Blackness comes from the Curse of Ham. And just as a reminder, so who's Ham? Ham is one of the three sons of Noah. And the story of the Curse of Ham is that Noah was so happy to get off that ark that one day he had a little bit too much to drink, and he found himself outside of his clothes. And Ham saw his father naked, and he told his other brothers about, hey, dad is naked, drunk in the tent. And his other two brothers, Seth and Japheth, instead of making fun of their father, they cover their father's nakedness, right? So Shem, so Seth, not Seth, Shem and Japheth cover their father's nakedness. They don't, and versus Ham puts his father's nakedness out for display and for ridicule, right? So that's one sort of basic reading of the story. But this story begins to circulate in the Middle Ages, and it circulates quite widely in the Renaissance. And here is a particularly gross version of that story, which so I'm a Shakespearean, I teach Shakespeare, and this is written very contemporary to the time of Shakespeare. So this is from the English explorer George Best, A True Discourse of the Late Voyages of Discovery. And I apologize for reading such a long passage, but it's all pretty significant. It manifestly and plainly appeareth by Holy Scripture that after the general inundation and overflowing of the earth, there remained no more men alive but Noah, his three sons, Shem, Cam, and Japheth, who only were left to possess and inhabit the whole face of the earth. Therefore, all the land that until this day hath been inhabited by sundry descents must needs come of the offspring either of Shem, Ham, or Japheth, as the only three sons of Noah. So I'll just stop there. So basically, because after the great flood, there were only Noah and his family left, the argument he is making is that, well, therefore, everybody in the world today is a direct descendant of one of Noah's three sons, right? And this was the way in which people in the Renaissance and before understood the peopling of the earth, that everyone was descended from one of these three sons. But this is where it gets interesting. Who, all three being white, okay, and their wives also, by course of nature, should have begotten and brought forth white children. But the envy of our great and continual enemy, the wicked spirit, is such that as he could not suffer our old father Adam to live in the felicity and angel-like state, wherein he was first created, but tempted him and sought and procured his ruin and fail. So again, finding at this flood none but a father and 3 sons living, he so caused one of them to transgress and disobey his father's commandment, that after him all his posterity should be accursed. God would a son should be born, whose name was Cush, who not only itself, but all his posterity after him should be so black and loathsome that it might remain a spectacle of disobedience to the whole world, or to all the world. So just a couple of things to point out. One is that according to Best, this is manifestly and plainly appeareth by Holy Scripture. Now, if any of you have ever read the story in Genesis, none of this is in the story, right? But we can see the way in which Scripture is being used to, used for the purposes of anti-Blackness, right? We also learn, I think maybe to many of our surprises, that everybody on the ark was white. Again, I think, well, how does Best know, right? But I think we see here is that there is this assumption being made about the biblical characters that is emerging in the Renaissance, that everybody in the Bible is white. But alongside that, anyone who is not white is a deviation from God's natural intention, right? So had everybody been good as they should have been, everybody to this day would be white. But because of sin, because the devil got into Ham and made him do this bad thing, God cursed Ham, made him black and loathsome, and therefore all of his descendants are black and loathsome as a spectacle of disobedience to all the world, right? So this is the view of Black people that is circulating in Renaissance Europe, right? And what Best is suggesting is that, well, when you see a Black person, and one of the things that we actually do know, sometimes we think of Renaissance Europe as being an all white space, but there actually were Black Africans in Europe in the Renaissance, and before that, that when a European white person saw a Black person, this is a very probable narrative, right? A story that a Renaissance white person could have conjured in their own mind, a story that they had been told plainly and manifestly appears in Scripture about who that Black person is, right? And that Black person is connected to a long history of cursedness, right? So Blackness becomes a sign of being a cursed people. All right, so that is the history that I've been thinking about. This is the history that I work on in my own scholarship, but I do think this history is relevant for us to think about today. And these are some questions that I would ask us to think about. How might this history help us rethink the function of white Jesus today? So knowing this history, does this change our understanding of what it means to represent white Jesus today, as well as how a lot of people would feel about white Jesus? Does this history ask us to acknowledge and rethink the religious, spiritual, political, and emotional investments in white skin? How has this history shaped feelings about Black skin? And third, how might we think differently about whose lives are deemed sacred and whose lives are not? So those are my closing questions. And as I close, I would just draw your attention to this particular image here, just to maybe meditate upon as we are having our Q&A. So the image on the left is by a African-American Detroit artist, Tylon Sawyer, and it is called the Pietà. The image on the right is also called the Pietà, but it is one that you are probably much more familiar with, and it is by Michelangelo, right? So Tylon Sawyer this is a 2018 image, and he is really asking us to think about the relationship between his image and this more famous image of Mary and her child, Jesus. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, Dennis, for this presentation. Do me a favor, am I unsharing your screen?
Yes, I can do that.
That'd be great. And I know we've got some Q&A, and while people are kind of getting their thoughts together, I thought I'd just get the ball rolling, and consistent with kind of what we've talked about in the past, the idea of trying to use history or use what you share with us to kind of contextualize, you know, kind of pressing issues of today, right? So you brought up the issue of iconoclasm, right? And I immediately, as you were talking in your presentation, I immediately thought of the Confederate monuments and the issues that we're facing today, right? In terms of tearing down images, right? As part of a political, advanced political perspective. So my question to you is this, they seem similar, and are they, and I wrote it down because I wanted to make sure I got this question right. So are Confederate monuments examples or modern day examples of this trying to rewrite history and reshape it into the visions that are more representative? I know that, well, I'll leave it at that and let you answer.
Yes, most definitely. And you know, one of the reasons I think the sort of Protestant Reformation and the Protestant iconoclasm might be a way of thinking about iconoclasm today is that I think Protestants realize that these images, they do stuff, right? And that people do have emotional investments in symbols and in imagery, right? Now, again, for right or for wrong, right? You know, I think one of the things, if you go to a cathedral and you see the aftermath of iconoclasm, you know, you're like, well, I wonder what this room would have looked like with the stained glass in there, right? So I think, you know, those are questions that one sort of, you know, approaches, you know, these you know, Protestant, you know, iconoclasm with. But for the Protestants, right, one of the reasons that they also wanted to get these images is that they reminded them of a past that they were trying to distance themselves from, right? So for them, you know, these images were associated with Catholic idolatry and Catholic abuses, right? So part of the reason to sort of get rid of these images was also to say, no, that was then, this is now, we are invested in a different type of Christianity, right? So I do think there are some interesting analogies of tearing down these Confederate monuments. But also, you know, I want to sort of think about this idea of rewriting history. And this is one of the ideas, one of the reasons why I think the humanities, so pro-humanities, right, is so important, because, you know, people get real upset with get real upset at the idea of tearing down these Confederate monuments. But we also need to think about, well, why were these monuments put there in the first place, right? Right. So again, you know, one of the things I said, you know, we need to read or interpret these representations of white Jesus alongside the stories that are being told, right, at the time in which they are being produced. So we also need to read these monuments alongside the history in which they were being produced, right? So again, this is not my area of scholarship. This is just my general interest and, you know, just reading, you know, various articles on this. But most of these Confederate monuments appear in the late 19th through the early part of the 20th century. A lot of them are being put up, most being put up by an organization known as the Daughters of the Confederacy, and their goal was explicitly to rewrite history, right? And some have said that the putting up these monuments was part of a larger campaign of turning the South's defeat into a victory, right? And sort of creating the North and the abolitionists as the enemy to a particular way of life. So the Daughters of the Confederacy were responsible for having these monuments put up across the country, right? There are even Confederate monuments in California. I'm from California. You're like, what is a Confederate monument doing in California? But they're all over the country, right? Because there are chapters of this organization all over the country, right? But so they were there for that reason. And some have said, well, that was actually the least of their ills, was the putting up of these monuments, that the Daughters of the Confederacy were very actively invested in the telling of history and the retelling of history, and that they were actually responsible for a lot of the history textbooks that were being used in Southern schools up into the 1970s, right? So we think about, and the stories that were being told in these Southern textbooks were that, the Civil War was not about slavery, right? It was about states' rights, right? It wasn't about slavery at all, right? They celebrated these Confederate pro-slavery racist, members of the Confederate Army. That they included in these textbooks images of the happy slave, right? So yeah, the slaves were happy, they danced, they sang, the masters treated them really well, right? So, so that they were rewriting the history of the Civil War. They were rewriting the history of the South. And the monuments were part of that history. And so part of, so again, I'm sorry, I'm talking too long. I should make room for other questions. But part of the call to take down these monuments actually is a call to correct history, right? That these monuments were put up as a rewriting of history, and now is the time to correct it. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you.
We've got quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to read you a couple of those. So our first question comes from Hannah, and she asks, are there other literary examples of a Black genealogy like Ham's, i.e. a mythical precursor that originates the family tree as Blackness?
Yes, there are. And actually, I've been working on some of them right now. And of course, I can't. So there's another writer from the English Renaissance named George Sandys, who also sort of provides us with the same story. He's also from the 16th century, provides us with the same story of Ham. And again, I'll focus on my period because that's what I know the most about. There's a long poetic poem by a poet, a Scottish poet from the 16th century named Henrik Clapman. He actually decides to write the entire book of Genesis in poetic form. And we sort of see the same story appearing there, right? So Best is not alone, right? That this story is, I don't know about other languages. I'm a professor of English. Someone who is a professor of French or Italian or Spanish might be able to tell me whether, there are examples from the 16th and 17th century. But yes, there are a number of examples of the story being told and retold.
I was going to say, Tricia, we've got a raised hand. I was going to. Looks like Luis Castavelvi Lockham. So let me unmute you. And Luis, go ahead with your question. Luis, are you there?
I'm muted.
Hey, well, okay. Well, maybe he'll come back to us.
Well, we've got some other questions in the chat, so I'll ask you another one of those. Marcia asked, do you know if there are any religious groups that use representations of a non-white Jesus?
Yes. Yes. So I think, a number of African-American churches. If you go to, across this country, you'll see Black Jesus in the altar as part of the altar, right? And I think, that's an explicit reaction or rejection of white Jesus, right? So yes, most certainly, in African-American churches, across the country, not all, you'll find Black Jesuses. Definitely in African churches, you'll see similar, Jesus was always Black in the Ethiopian church, right? And the Ethiopian church is an ancient church, right? It predates the European church, right? So there were Christians in Africa before there were Christians in Europe. So yes, there is, I don't know much about it. And I think some people are putting things in the chat, so check that out. I think a lot of people know about this, so this is great. I do know, and I don't know much about it, but I do believe there's a very small sort of denomination, African-American denomination of sort of Orthodox Christianity. So they don't connect themselves to sort of Eastern or Eastern Orthodoxy or sort of, Coptic Christians in Africa, but a particular sort of sect of Christian Black Orthodox who their devotion is specifically sort of centered around the Black Madonna. and Black Jesus, right? So that the sort of image of Black Jesus and the Black Madonna is actually sort of central to their worship. So yeah.
Tricia, let me try to, Luis said I wasn't able to unmute him. So let me try this one more time. Luis, are you there?
Hello. Yeah, hello. I think it's working now.
There we go.
Regards from Spain. It's almost midnight here.
Wow. Wow, thank you for chiming in.
No, that was my pleasure, Professor Britton. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. So this is my question. I thought it was very interesting that you shared with us two paintings from early modern Spain, El Greco and Zurbarán. And I think maybe that's not a coincidence, in the sense that the vast majority of Black people living in early modern Europe were in the Iberian Peninsula. Like all the other literatures in the UK, in France, in Italy, were talking secondhand about Black people. Most of them were in Portugal and Spain. So my question is, reading the sources from this period, I often have the impression that the Europeans started to see themselves as white precisely in this period, as in opposition to the Black people that were coming from Africa. So do you think that maybe this construction of whiteness, and particularly of the white Jesus, that there's something in these Iberian sources, in these Spanish paintings, that we can see this idea maybe more clearly there than in other countries? Or you think it's like widespread all around Europe with no distinction? Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, thank you for that question. And I feel like you might be better able to answer that question than me. I think that's a really interesting question. And one of the things that Luis, I'm sorry I don't have your last name there, is sort of pointing to us is that there was we know that there was a sizable Black populations in Spain in the Renaissance, right? More so than there are in other European nations. So there are Black people in other European nations, but but there are Black communities in Spain, and that, and they're Black, and there's, so anyways, they're much more sort of known and present in Spain than they are in other places. So, and yeah, I do think, and I do think that there is, a carryover that, and actually I do believe that people in England, I'll stick to England because that's what I know the most about, that people are learning something about race from Spain. And part of this has to do with, the translation of Spanish texts into English. There are some, some Spanish texts. Again, this is not my particular area of specialty, but I have looked at least one sort of English history of the Spanish reconquest of Spain, which was translated by Sir Walter Raleigh. Who folks might know Sir Walter Raleigh. It's who Raleigh, Virginia is named, or not Raleigh, Raleigh, North Carolina is named after. And a very famous English explorer came to the Americas, was part of the court of Queen Elizabeth. In which, that people are really interested in Spain and learning from Spain, even though there's lots of anti-Spanish sentiment during the English Renaissance, and people in England actually often blacken Spaniards because of their own mixed Islamic, Christian, Jewish history. But at the same time, I think you're right. I believe that is the case, that there are learning something about race through reading Spanish texts, and the fact that Spain had been representing literary, through literature, as well as in writing, have been dealing with, you might say, not non-white people for a long time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Gracias por tu pregunta, Luis.
Gracias a vosotros.
Okay.
We've got another question in the chat from Reginald Wilburn, which asks, how do you or we interpret the white Jesus who makes possible the understood white Jesus of Black worship and or liberation theology?
Read that one more time. That sounds heavy.
How do you or we interpret the white Jesus who makes possible the understood white Jesus of Black worship and or liberation theology?
Ooh. So that's from my UNH colleague, Dr. Reginald Wilburn, who also thinks a lot about, race and Christianity, who works with Milton and African-American literature. So I'm not surprised he would ask me such a really deep question that I'm gonna have to get him for asking me that question, but we'll think about it later. I think that's a really interesting question that I don't have an answer for. But I would say that, well, actually, maybe I do have some thoughts about it, is that, that Black Jesus actually is sort of deliberately constructed against white Jesus, right? And, I've sort of seen this in, right, so maybe there is no Black Jesus without white Jesus, right? But of course, that Black Jesus emerges because of the oppressive nature of white Jesus and the ways in which white Jesus has been so wrapped up in all the stuff I try to lay out. And of course, there are white Jesus in Black churches too, right? And and for some, the whiteness of Jesus, or Jesus being white in the image, is not seen as antithetical to their spiritual formation and their spirituality, right? So Reginald and I were talking about my presentation a few days ago, and he reminded me of an episode of Good Times, in which oh God, well, I'm blanking on all my JJ characters, all my characters right now. In which the mother from Good Times, she has a white Jesus on her wall. Thank you, Michael, Florida. Thank you. So Florida has this white Jesus on her wall. JJ has painted a Black Jesus, and Michael, being the radical that he is, wants to replace white Jesus with Black Jesus. And Florida is like, this is the only Jesus I know. Like, I don't know who that other Jesus is, right? But it would be too easy to say that, Florida is anti-Black and she don't understand, but like, you're right, that there's this, that for Florida, and for others, right, that, they are not dependent upon white, Jesus's, having Black skin to liberate themselves, or to move toward the liberatory project. But also, again, there is this tradition of, and within sort of Black liberation theology, of sort of insisting that Jesus is Black. And sometimes that's a rhetorical move, right? And it's not so much that, I think Black liberation theology is like, literally, at least some of the examples I've read, that literally Jesus was Black historically. But the idea is that Black Jesus is so in opposition to white supremacy, right, that the only way to undo white supremacy is to have a Black Jesus, right, because they're antithetical to each other, right? So that Black Jesus becomes the solution too, right? So whether or not Jesus was Black, or historically, is actually not the point, but we need a Black Jesus because only a Black Jesus can undo white supremacy. So
I see we've got a couple of hands raised, so I'm gonna, I see the first one is Bob Thompson. I think that I'm hitting, you might have to unmute yourself. I think this is Reverend Thompson.
Yeah, that's me.
There you are.
Thank you, Dr. Britton, and thank you, Dr. Wilburn Williams, for that, for that wonderful question. I think that in the lived experience of Black Christians, the iconography becomes irrelevant compared to the actual religious experience. Every Sunday you would have almost little mystical opportunities as women and men get seized by the Holy Spirit, and their lives are transformed. They get energy to go on. They are sustained, and then the social structure of the church enables them to be supported in their physical or the material needs as well. So that, and then you have a lot of people who are worshiping without any images of Jesus at all. The churches are too small, or they just don't see it, or it's just another of a series of passing images that don't really relate to you, but just capture an idea. So I don't think that in the Black church there was any confusion about white Jesus, meaning that God was anti-Black. That wasn't the issue. God wasn't confused. Jesus was not confused. These other people, they're the ones who don't have it right. So it didn't really matter what color for a lot of, up until maybe the 60s, people began thinking about it a little more intentionally. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
All right. And I'm seeing preach and yes in the comments. So thank you, Reverend Thompson. So Reverend Thompson is a local minister here in New Hampshire. So thank you. Thank you for those words.
Now, Tricia, Dr. PM, we're getting close to the at the end time, and I don't want to cut off the conversation. We probably got time for a couple more questions. Dr. Britton, if you're willing to stay for a little extra, for a couple more questions, by a show of hands, just real quick, would anybody like a couple more questions? All right, the jury has it. Trisha, one more question. Let's get a couple more questions in.
I'm going to hit some of these raised hands because I think they've been up for a while. So I see the director of the UNH Humanities Center. Stephen, I'm going to unmute you. Oh, where'd you go? Maybe not.
All right, I've been unmuted.
Yeah.
Hey, Dennis, thank you. That was really fascinating. I'm actually picking up a little bit on Luis's question about Iberia, but you know, this in my experience, this question of blackness as the unholy color has to do with another Islamic conquest and another thing, which is the Islamic conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean pretty early on. And that's when I think in Greek hagiography, and you can, El Greco is Greek, you begin to get this notion of the Ethiopian as the punisher. So there's Saint Kerkyra, her father doesn't like the fact that she, you know, converted to Christianity. So he sends an Ethiopian into her prison cell to rape her. And you have that sexualized black body coming in, and it's that, you know, this is literally the work of Satan, and you have all this kind of stuff. It may be connected sociologically to the fact that there were, you know, black Africans in Islamic armies, but you have this tension that goes on, and I'd encourage you to, for instance, look at someone like Saint Moses the Ethiopian. And the story goes, it's not he's an early saint, but it's not a very early story, that when he's finally made into a priest, the bishop who consecrates him dresses him in all white and says, "Now you're white." Father Moses is now all white. And so it's this, it emerges, I think, partly out of that self-definition of whiteness, but also Christianity. They seem to me to be intimately linked from the very beginning of sort of Islamic Christian sort of tensions.
Thank you for that. You know, and I don't know very much about Eastern Christianity, and particularly around the time period in which you work, but thank you for that. I will definitely check into that. But yeah, you're right, that so much of this anti-blackness is connected to anti-Islamicism, right? And to connections between, and the tensions between Christians and Islam. Yeah, great. Thank you for that.
Looks like we also had a question from David Brown. So David, let me unmute you. And you might have to unmute yourself there. David, are you there? Maybe, Trish, you want to go to maybe another question while David gets himself unmuted there?
I had another question in the chat. Let me just go back to it here. It was a question from Jennifer, and she asked if you could just speak more about the difference between creating images of Christ in your own image and creating the white Christ that supports white supremacy.
Right. So, yeah. So I think part of it is, you know, right, and some of this is, you know, I think, you know, again, this is not my particular sort of area of specialty, but, you know, some of it's sort of anthropologically speaking, that when people think about the human, right, or when they begin to represent the human, you know, their only reference of the human is themselves, right, and people that look like them, right. So, you know, if I'm in a cave in France, right, in somewhere, and all the people look, you know, and I say, and someone says, you know, draw a person, right. That person is going to look like people of that particular era in time, right? So part of it is, you know, as these stories, so that's, you know, that's sort of one explanation, that, you know, the people are always more likely to sort of represent the universal, right, within their own idiom, you know, and with their own understandings of, you know, what it means to be human, right? So that's one thing of it. You know, some, you know, have said, well, you know, with some Christian, not all, right, because obviously Christian missionaries definitely brought, white Jesus with them, but some said, well, there was also an effort by some Christian missionaries to bring ethnic Jesuses, or to encourage converts to paint Jesus in their own image as a way to facilitate conversion, right? So for some, you're like, well, Jesus is just like you, like there was also, and I know less about this, but that was used by some Christian missionaries. So I think, but for the difference I see in Western representations, and this is not just me. I think this is, me reading art historians from the time period and other scholars, is sort of looking at a particular change that begins to happen in the representations. So there's, I can't get her name, but reading one art historian, she sort of notes that stained glass, this treatment of stained glass actually begins to change in the 13th century. And she said, particularly what you sort of see is a sort of, the skin color of the disciples and of Jesus changes, right? It becomes whiter, it becomes clearer, right? And it may not just be a technological development, right? Because we see those colors already being used in other places, right? So for whatever reason, right, we begin to see skin color changing in stained glass in Europe in the 13th century, right? So for this particular critic, well, why is that, right? And her argument is that, well, it's Europeans are maybe becoming more self-aware of themselves as being white. And I think, I think, both Luis's and Stephen's context, what they brought up about Spain and the medieval East, right? That, as Christians are beginning to define themselves in opposition to Muslims and people in the East, one way to do that is to say, we are white, they are not, right? Christians are white, non-Christians are not white. So that would be my answer to that question.
Okay, I'm going to give you just one final question from the chat here from Christopher. He asks, Dr. Britton, could you say a little bit more about the impact of white Jesus? How do you think things would change if we had a Black or historically accurate Jesus?
Oh, how would things change? You mean, that's an interesting question. So if Jesus, all of a sudden, everyone just sort of came to a consensus today that Jesus was a man of color, I do, actually, maybe things would change, right? Because again, I do think, and one of the things I ended with that image of Sawyer's image of Pietà next to Michelangelo's, right? Because I do think, right, then again, and I don't necessarily think this is happening on on like a conscious level, right? One of the things that, one of my areas of study is the history of emotions, and right, and a lot of, that our emotions have history. We feel how we feel about things or objects or other people, and that history predates us, right? That history is not written by ourselves, but it's written through a long history of stories and narratives, right? And sometimes we feel specific ways about other people and ideas for reasons we are not even aware of, right? And so for me, right, I think that, that this white Jesus and the whitening of the saints and a sort of, the ways that medieval Christians and Renaissance Christians were being taught to feel about white skin, right? And seeing white skin as sacred, right? And being able to map their own skin onto the skin of Christ, right? That, that sort of shapes a whole way of feeling about whiteness and Blackness, right? So I guess I'm talking myself into an answer that had Jesus been Black, right, or brown, that the history of feeling would be different, right? We would feel very differently today about Black and brown people.